Today on the Forgiven Nutritionist podcast, I'm talking with Dr. Ackerman. He is a Harvard Medical School trained psychiatrist who has 45 years of clinical experience. He has also innovated a model of group therapy based on mindfulness and runs therapy educational groups across the state of Rhode Island. His approach to mindfulness training involves learning how to access and develop the best parts of ourselves by understanding our human brain better. In that sense, he considers himself to be a brain educator, and his prescribing philosophy is, don't just medicate, educate. He's a published author. His innovative work can be found on Amazon, and it's called Me, Myself, and My Amygdala, a mindfulness guide to sobriety and well-being. Here's a clip from today's show.
And that we purposely train ourselves to identify, what do I need to let go of? What do I need to liberate myself from? What has become toxic to me mentally? One other corollary of this is that the part of the brain that stores traumatic memory is called the hippocampus. And lo and behold, that part of the brain sits right adjacent to the amygdala. And it's like having a noisy neighbor always throwing parties so you can't get sleep at night. It's a bit of a setup. And I did my training in Boston, and there was an area of Boston where you're not supposed to walk at night because it was dangerous. And it was called the combat zone.
Oh, boy.
But in my book, I refer to this part of the brain, the hippocampus and the amygdala, as the combat zone.
Hey, everyone. Just a quick break to show some gratitude to our sponsors and give you some special deals. BrainMD nutraceuticals are high-quality supplements specifically designed to support and enhance brain health. Developed by Dr. Daniel Amen and his team of experts, these supplements use carefully selected ingredients backed by scientific research to promote cognitive function, mood stability, and overall mental wellness. BrainMD's commitment to purity and efficacy assures that their supplements provide targeted nutrition for the optimal brain performance and long-term brain health. Be sure to click my link in the show notes. Well, thank you so much again for joining me today, Dr. Ackerman.
My pleasure.
Now, I'm familiar with you, but why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and who you are, maybe how you ended up in psychiatry?
Okay. I'm a Harvard Medical School trained psychiatrist. I've been in the field for over 40 years. I would say in the early part of my career, I got very interested and became a founding member of the American Family Therapy Association. And what I became interested in was the influence of people surrounding the person that was struggling and what the relationship was between a member of a group and the group itself. And the family became the unit of focus. If I were to jump ahead, in the last decade, I have returned to an interest of what's going on inside each individual between their ears. And the mixture of paying attention to the things impacting someone from the outside, as well as the things impacting them from the inside, has been sort of the heart of where my work has evolved. So I have become, in the last decade, a meditation teacher, a mindfulness trainer. And what I think of now and what I'm encouraging my field to do is to move in the direction of becoming brain educators. I look at the brain as the most incredible organ evolution ever created, and it would just be nice to know how to use it.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And I'm very new to learning about a lot more of the intricacies of the brain, and I'll never know nearly as much as you and a plethora of other doctors because, as you said, there's just so much to learn. And I'm definitely grateful for a lot of practitioners like yourself, because I know for the years that I'd struggled, no one ever really took the time, no therapist, doctor, anybody ever really took the time to explain some of those things. It was just the immediately, oh, you've got depression, or, oh, you've got anxiety. Let's try this medication, or let's try that medication, rather than trying to figure out, okay, so if it sounds like these symptoms, this is possibly the area without even looking at it, but okay, it might be this area of the brain. Let's work on some of these things to help that area of the brain, and that's what I like about yourself, because you look at those areas and you work at those specific areas rather than just, and again, not saying medication still may not be necessary or definitely help in certain situations, but you have a lot of other techniques and things in your toolbox that you use. And I'm grateful for that as well. And I hope other people learn about some of those techniques and tips too.
But it's interesting too that the real estate world has been way ahead of us, because they've known for some time that it's location, location, location. And we are now understanding better that the brain wasn't all created, the human brain wasn't created all at one time. It was created in staggered ways over billions of years. And it has a history to it. Much the same way if you're bought a house and you got inspected and you found out, well, some of the wiring's the old tube and wire, which is not up to code these days, but some of it is fine. And then you're trying to figure out, well, what do I do with the older wiring? So in terms of the brain's history, there's an extremely primitive part of the brain, which is really one of the most amazing parts of our brain, called the brainstem. And this is the part of the brain that operates like the furnace room in a home or an apartment building, condo, where it keeps the lights on, so to speak. It runs the heart, it runs the breathing, keeps our body temperature regulated, regulates our blood sugar levels. This part, which is just above the spinal cord, the brainstem, works 24/7, never takes a coffee break, never asks for a raise. It's really a phenomenon. It's indefatigable. And then that's the most ancient part of the brain. And then just above that is the area that I began writing about because it's the most problematic area that affects our psychology, the amygdala, which is the fight or flight part of the brain. And then on top of that area is the most advanced area of the brain, the most recent area, and that's the prefrontal cortex, which has tripled in size over our nearest mammalian relative. And that really has become our superhero, our superpower, if you will. And that's the part that continues to be open for development and strengthening throughout the lifetime. And it's the central area I focus in meditation and mindfulness, because we're really trying to strengthen a part of our brain, just like we're strengthening a bicep. And it's not a muscle, so it doesn't strengthen by resistance, but it functions a little bit like Facebook connections. The more connections are made, the stronger the signal gets. So you can actually strengthen your prefrontal cortex by doing activities the prefrontal cortex was designed to do.
Well, and I think that since you mentioned Facebook, I think that'll definitely help people really understand some of how the brain works then as well. The more connections you have, the stronger it becomes. And
the connections work. The neuroscience term for it is agonism versus antagonism. These connections work by either encouraging the next nerve to fire, encouraging the next association pattern to be activated, or discouraging it or inhibiting it. It's either one or the other. And again, the more the connections are encouraging something to happen, the more it's likely to happen. If that happens to be a beneficial thing, so much the better. If it happens to be a counterproductive thing, we're in real trouble.
Well, and one of my things that I found myself years ago as well. You get a diagnosis, and I just kind of sank into my diagnosis thinking, okay. Then I started to identify as I had depression, or
Absolutely.
I had anxiety. And so I became that instead of realizing the potential that I could reverse or completely change my life by just fixing a few simple things.
Right.
And again, not that it's easy, because sometimes some of those things can be habitual, and those are the hardest things to overcome and work through, I think.
So that issue you raise is at the heart of the title of the book that I have published, Me, Myself, and My Amygdala, is specifically to work on the issues of what part of my brain do I identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found is that people are way too over-identified with this rather primitive, hardwired, built-in part of the brain that can be rather nasty at times. And it's the fight or flight area of the brain. So that's why the title is Me, Myself, and My Amygdala, which it basically means I'm not my amygdala, but I do have one.
Mm-hmm.
So in the classes that I teach, to help people separate themselves from their over-identification with the amygdala, I give an example like I have a gallbladder, but I never think of myself as a gallbladder. I have a pancreas, but I never think of myself as a pancreas. I can think about what's in the gallbladder, bile, but I never think of myself as bile. So I can have something that's in me that doesn't represent me.
Mm-hmm.
If I can have it in my abdomen, I can have it in my brain too. So having an amygdala doesn't mean that you are what the amygdala dishes out, whether that's depression, anxiety, excessive anger. You have it, you got to figure out what to do with it, but it is not you. The corollary of that is that what is so unique about the human brain is not that we have a kind of challenging amygdala, but we're the first brain that has the capacity in all of evolution to even be aware that it has a brain, which is mind-boggling.
It is
and
mind-boggling.
That's really what highlights how important awareness is. And we can go have an aha moment that evolution must have meant this awareness to be our survival benefit. And now if we can also train that awareness to becoming even more refined and more strengthened, more potent, our upward potential is really, the sky is not even the limit.
Well, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on was because you say on your website that you think that the brain is one of the most fascinating things. And so I naturally just gravitate to people who kind of think that, especially because, like I said, years ago, I just sank into my diagnosis and didn't think anything about my brain or myself, anything in my body or how I could help it or have control over it. And so now I've learned some things, and I like that fact that people identify as, like you said, you have a gallbladder. You're not the gallbladder or the bile or anything that's in it. And your book is not just about me, myself, and my amygdala. It's a mindfulness guide to sobriety and well-being.
Right.
And I think that not enough people really. My addiction was to Coca-Cola. And so I have an empathy because, that struggle was hard enough to overcome, giving up Coca-Cola. I can't even imagine what it would be like to overcome and give up something as addictive as, beer or alcohol or opioid addiction or anything like that. So, but I think once that people learn a little bit about the brain or the amygdala, that might help them feel a little more confident, hopefully, that there's possibilities for them. And I want people to realize that there's always a possibility.
Did you know in the original formula of Coca-Cola, there was cocaine?
Yes. I'm glad I didn't live in the 20s or whenever that was that they had that.
But one of the things I was even thinking about today was to help distinguish true needs from self-created needs, even if the self-created need is unintended. So, for example, we need oxygen. And the withdrawal from not having oxygen is pretty intense if you've ever come up from underwater or had a panic attack.
Yes.
Right? So we actually need oxygen, but our body doesn't need Coca-Cola. It only begins to think it needs it once we put it in. So the segue to the kind of the substance use work that I did was that the bottom line is we're looking at a self-imposed problem. In the beginning was not alcohol. In the beginning was not nicotine. In the beginning was not Coca-Cola. And I've seen people recently who have had liver transplants because they took excess amounts of Tylenol. In the beginning was, I'm going to do something, and for whatever reasons, I'm going to downplay thinking there could be an adverse effect. And the way I reformulated that was in subconscious, unconscious self-injury impulse driven by a part of the brain. Now, in helping to empower people to see that that's eminently tackable, I bring into my education classes a brain model so they can visualize. And I'll give you an example. I have one here. So people can actually see what the brain looks like, what we're looking at. And I'll show them both where the amygdala is and the size of it, which is about the size of that cap. And they go, that little whippersnapper is sending me around the bend. That little whippersnapper is driving me to use Coca-Cola or Coke or anything. And the answer is yes. The corollary of that is, again, thinking of location, 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 is each part of the brain wants and needs different things. And if we're using this green area, which is underrepresented here, which is the prefrontal cortex, the only part of the brain that has the capacity to be aware of the other parts. This is evolution's genius for our species, because it allows us to do something that no other species has ever been able to do, which is to be aware of its different components. This part, the prefrontal cortex, can understand what the purpose of the different parts are, can learn about them, and can see if each part is actually fulfilling its purpose or getting blocked in some way. So again, when I talked earlier about the brainstem, that's this area. That part accomplishes its purpose 24/7. Spectacular. When we look at the prefrontal cortex, the purpose of that is to be able to learn, to be self-aware, and also to be discerning and selective about what from the rest of the brain is necessary. I compare the prefrontal cortex to the orchestra leader of a conductor who knows the music so well that they know what has to come from the other parts to bring out the music and the harmony. And only this executive functioning part can be aware of all the other parts. And it can see the amygdala saying, like an infant, I'm hungry, I'm starving, or whatever. And it can make an assessment as to what it truly needs, what would benefit it, and whether it is raising a true need or a false need. So if we have a part of our brain, which is a hard pill to swallow, that actually kind of fakes us out or fools us, but we have the capacity to be aware of it, then we can treat that part like the kid coming over on Halloween with a mask on. And, we can say, I know who you are. A pretense. I'm starving. I can't be without X. I have to have. all that we can see as kind of self-talk that's creating an illusion and leading to counterproductive and at times self-harming behavior. So getting back to the substance abuse world, the kind of subtitle of my book, I've been staff psychiatrist on two major substance treatment hospitals where the primary model of treatment is addiction. And it's not that addiction doesn't play a role or is a component, but the relapse rate is ridiculous. And it just occurred to me there has to be more than addiction that counts for this. Because even when people think that they're addicted, it creates a passivity. Well, if I'm addicted, what can I do? And then you end up, your only resource is to say, I'm helpless against the addiction and pray to a higher power for rescue. And the approach that I take is we have a wonderful higher power, and it's right in our brain. Mm-hmm. And we can learn how to even strengthen that power. And what that power has to recognize is that in the human brain itself, oddly, is a self-injurious impulse. And it's a head scratcher because you go, what the heck is a self-injurious impulse doing in the most advanced organ of survival ever created? And I have two books that are going to follow this year, one of which is inspired by an experience my wife had just a couple months ago when she was coming back from the mailbox. And she was brushed back by and looked up, and it was a gigantic hawk that was making a beeline, it turns out, for a rabbit in the grass. She heard a yelping, screeching, and she thought the hawk got hurt and called animal rescue. And it turned out it was a bloodbath for the rabbit. And the hawk was simply trying to make off with its capture. But my point in hearing her describe that story is that part of the bird's brain that drove that vicious attack is the bird's amygdala. And that's the part that drives it aggression in the service of food for survival. We can link those pieces. We can understand that. But what we're looking at in the human brain is the same thing. We also can display aggression outwardly. But we also have this extra added feature, which is self-directed aggression. The most common of which is, how could I be so stupid? Right? But it can get to the point of self-loathing, self-hatred, and actual self-harm. And so when I was looking at, both the severity of the folks in the substance world, the liver damage, the pancreatic damage, the brain damage from the drugs that were being used, and saying, well, it's almost as if they were trying to harm themselves, or if they did not care about whether they harmed themselves or not. And I introduced the notion that, well, yes, you could be addicted to caffeine, tobacco, Coca-Cola, any kind of substance, but you really cannot be addicted to self-harm. That's a bit of an oxymoron. It just doesn't add up. At the minimum, you're going to find yourself in battle. And I remember one of the questions you sent me is, what do I mean by the concept of having two brains?
Yeah.
So to try to simplify the psychology of our brain, because the entire brain isn't psychological. We have a motor cortex that moves our arms and legs. It's not psychological. We have a visual cortex that sees, an audio cortex that hears, a language cortex that speaks, a part of our brain, the cerebellum, that keeps us physically balanced. They're not particularly psychological. But we do have a self-concept that's derived somewhere. And we do have feelings about ourselves, and we do have behaviors we have to manage. Those come from certain areas. And to not oversimplify it, but to help to see the clarity of it, there's one part of our psychology that's derived from our amygdala. And the amygdala is the fight or flight area. And it's the seat of aggression and fear. Now, Freud, first getting back to depression, described depression as aggression turned against the self. Well, here we're coming full circle. The first brain ever to not only direct aggression outwardly, but inwardly. And here we get depressed. Here we have the beginning of negative self-thinking. Here we have both excessive aggression and excessive anxiety, fight or flight, of the intensity that was captured in the Hawk incident, and yet also directed against ourselves. I mean, it's no wonder we have challenges. But the notion is, in the substance world, that the problem is not out there in the drug. It's not that now you have to, be paranoid about the drug and make the drug the problem. The problem is the impulse part of your brain that would lead you to gravitate towards something that would be harmful to yourself.
Yeah, in your book you have something that's called the negative thought spiral, and you put a great diagram in there, and I think it really kind of brings it home because, like you said, and again, I only used to suffer from depression and anxiety, so I know what that's like, where you think some of those things, and then one thought just leads to another, and it's the vicious cycle.
Right. So part of what I teach in my classes is that not all thoughts are created equal. And getting back to location, they're not all created in the same part of the brain. So if you want to go back to the fight or flight and say, to what degree does that part of the brain think? To what degree does that part of the brain feel? What are its range of thoughts? What are its range of feelings? And it turns out it has some capacity to think, and it has some capacity to feel, but it's really constricted. So let's say feeling, we know it's fight or flight, so we know that part can get angry, and we know that part can get anxious and fearful. That's what it does for a living. It doesn't have many other places it can go, except for kissing cousins of all those feelings: guilt, shame, vindictiveness, all bitterness, all that stuff are derivatives of that area. But when we're feeling those negative spectrum feelings, we can actually know what part of our brain is lighting up. This is really where neuroscience is helping to take us, because when we're experiencing something, we can now on a PET scan see what part of the brain is lighting up. And this helps us to kind of locate where it's being generated. Now, so go back 200,000 years ago when the amygdala was a much more useful survival mechanism, because it kept going off like a false alarm system indicating danger was nearby. And it would keep us from falling asleep at night, so we wouldn't be someone's prey overnight. Okay, we see the benefit to us then, but now it's just an annoying thing that the alarm is going off all the time, and it's not founded on something. But back in the day, if it was generated a thought process, it would be, I wonder if I'm safe. And I better look and see if there's any predators out there. And I look, and now I start getting paranoid thoughts, which are considered by Freud pretty primitive thoughts, because I say, could there be something behind the tree that I haven't noticed yet? And I start getting suspicious, and I start having those kinds of thoughts. That's what the amygdala is capable of thinking and feeling: anxiety anger, fear, primitive thoughts. Whereas the prefrontal cortex does an entirely quantum leap different kind of thinking because it has the capacity, what I refer to as meta-thinking. It thinks about thinking. And it thinks about separating thoughts into useful, non-useful, beneficial, non-beneficial, accurate, inaccurate. And that is the part that, nature created to help us function at a much higher level. And that's the part that mindfulness training helps us to kind of hone in on and train, because we see exactly why we need to do that.
So my question then would be, so they're trying to, when somebody's amygdala is kind of lit up where they're having a lot of those thoughts, you're trying to tone that down a little bit and turn on the prefrontal cortex a little bit more. Yeah.
And one of the mistakes that people make when they begin meditation training, because the common refrain is, I can't do it. I'm just not good at it. And when we think of these two different parts, the prefrontal cortex is already a Buddha. It's already peaceful. The amygdala is never peaceful. It's wired to be always anxious. So if you're trying to get your amygdala to be calm, it won't. You cannot train the amygdala. Trying to train the amygdala is like trying to train a dog not to bark. Maybe you get it to quiet for a couple of minutes, but next disturbance, there they go. But you are trying to get the prefrontal cortex to recognize false alarms. And I think not overreact to them. The amygdala is the overreacting part of the brain. What I've described in this kind of sequel that I'm writing is that the intersection of Mother Nature, evolution, God, however you want to conceptualize it, was trying to figure out, didn't know exactly what human beings were going to need for their journey through life. So they had the tendency, like a nervous Nelly mother, to pack in excess. So in the knapsack, we find 5 sandwiches, 5 snacks, 5 pieces of fruit, all of which turn out to weigh us down. We don't need that much. But in deference to them, they didn't know how much we're going to need. And so what they provided was the trimming scissors, the capacity to recognize excess. And they said, we're going to leave it to you because we're going to make sure you have enough. And we're going to leave it to you to realize that you got more than you need. And you're going to have to learn to turn down, as you alluded to, the volume, the intensity on these excesses. And also not personalize them and see them as a reflection of you. This is the way we made you. But we also made you with the capacity to turn the volume down.
So you mentioned mindfulness before. Right. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, or what are some other things that people can do to turn up their prefrontal cortex that'll slowly turn the volume down on their amygdala?
So the notion is, takes off on the joke about the musician trying to get to Carnegie Hall and is asked, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And his answer is practice, practice, practice. And the notion is that to strengthen the prefrontal cortex, we want to do what the prefrontal cortex does more and more often. What does the prefrontal cortex do? What we were doing in the beginning, which is problem solving, which is that our brains are really good at problem solving. Something's not working. Immediately, we're in the business of trying to figure out what can we do to fix it. The prefrontal cortex loves to fix things. I think one of the most mindful people I ever knew in my life was my handyman, who just loved to fix things. Whereas, most people, when they come up against something that isn't working, we get really frustrated instead of seeing it as, well, that's a challenge. Let's figure out why it's not working and what we can do to. But the part of our brain that loves to problem solve, we can do it by practicing any kind of problem solving. Word puzzles, crossword puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, games. I have a book coming out that's aimed at helping kids to develop their prefrontal cortex, all based upon games, and even hide and seek is a great problem solving. If I look for you here but you're not here, and I look for you over there before but you're not there, and there's not enough time, probably you're over here. All that involves that part of the brain, the problem solving part of the brain, and this is an area of the brain that loves to learn. So the notion of food for thought, that part loves to learn. And it brings emotions at a higher level. We talked about the negative spectrum emotions being down in the amygdala area, the anger and the fear. In the upper registers, the prefrontal cortex is our capacity for true contentment, for joy, for love, compassion, all of which things we have plenty of if we can just get to it. We want to think like the prefrontal cortex is like the spring water, and we all have reservoirs of it. And the prefrontal cortex looks at us and says, why don't you use me? Why don't you call me? I'm right here.
I think my husband, if he were here, he would tell you that sometimes my prefrontal cortex, it works on overload because I am always problem solving especially unfortunately his life. and I think that's part of the mom in me, where, because I had kids. So I was always trying to help them or figure out or just do it myself.
Right.
So
the irony is what I think of is that there are many problems that our problem solver takes on, but the one I encourage people to take on in particular is their amygdala. Because that's a problem creator. Mm-hmm. It's enough that husbands create problems and kids create problems. But the notion that a part of our brain is a problem creator, whoa, that becomes a little bit of a head scratcher. But once we see that, now we can say, well, since I'm a very good, almost a natural problem solver, let me put this skill I have acquired to extra use for dealing with where I can spot my own amygdala. And so at the heart of mindfulness training is amygdala awareness training. I have a bumper sticker that goes, honk gently if you're aware of your amygdala, which is the notion of trying to, help everyone to understand that everyone has an amygdala. And the more that we are aware of it, the more that we see what we're up against. You're up against your amygdala, I'm up against mine, and you have to deal with the amygdala in your kids and in your husband and in all the people that you work with and friends and siblings. And everyone's walking around with one of these improvised explosive devices. That creates all sorts of havoc. At the same time, they also have this sort of amazing other part to them. And then we get back to this notion, well, which part of your brain are you identified with? And unfortunately, the way the brain is organized is that the part of the brain that comes on first is the amygdala. It's like DOS coming on before Windows. It's there, right? You wake up and you're in your amygdala. And you need coffee to try to get out of it. But once you kind of realize what the amygdala does, and it's not personal, you just see it as a relatively minor obstacle that we have to deal with, and then look at the prefrontal cortex as the complete tool chest for fixing almost any problem that you can come up with. But you got to realize the tools that are in it. And the key one that was put was the capacity for self-observation. Getting back to what is mindfulness training, it's a particular kind of self-observation that it's compassionate self-observation without judgment.
I think that's definitely hard for anybody, especially when they're in the throes of their amygdala working on overdrive and their prefrontal cortex not being utilized like it could or should be. And then we definitely have a tendency to, just really look down on ourselves. And then you feel like you to me, it's like I always refer to it like as a swirling drain. The closer you get to the drain, the faster it swirls and the more intensity it picks up,
The part that I encourage in that, awareness of that phenomenon, because that's an accurate description of it, but it's not an accurate description of your brain. It's only an accurate description of one small part of your brain. So that would be a key feature to remember, that the swirling is coming from there. And you have plenty of other thoughts that don't come from there, that don't swirl. And when you become aware of a swirling brain, you can say, don't do anything the swirling brain is telling you to do. Almost like you're in the water and you're caught in a swirl. You want to immediately get out of it. Our instincts in different comparable circumstances would immediately tell us what to do. But because we're so over-identified with it, we think this is us. I encourage the development of what I call the I-it relationship with the amygdala. Me, myself, and my amygdala. I am not my amygdala. If I am anything, I am the part of me that is able to observe that I have an amygdala. And also observe I have an observant part, the prefrontal cortex. That part of me that can observe the amygdala keeps a distance from it and observes what it does. Could even compliment it. Nice job, amygdala. You really got upset today. Impressive. I've never seen you get that way.
I will say
simply, I recognize you. I recognize that that's just the firings of some small piece of nerve tissue inherited by me as a human being with the best brain on the evolutionary market, which I refer to because I live in Rhode Island as a Rhode Island pothole, which is worth trying to avoid so you don't get a blowout.
Oh, yes, the potholes.
But it's small. Mm-hmm. It's a small area, and yes, it has a cascading effect, and we can also look in the diagrams as to why it has this cascading effect, why it makes it feel like it's us. But it's really a small part of the brain, and while the amygdala is doing its swirling thing, the rest of your brain is cool as a cucumber. And if it had a voice, it would say, don't say I'm swirling. I'm not swirling.
One thing that I did notice for myself over the last couple of years is, like you said before, that the brain lies. And it was very freeing to me when I realized that my brain can exaggerate things and tell me some false truths and put little spins on things where, that was part of that thought spiral, like you said. And so to me, that was like, once I heard somebody say that and I realized it, I think that alone was a small little baby step. It still took me quite a while, but I think once I learned that alone was very powerful to me to get some kind of little stop in there every
Yes.
once in a while.
One thing I would add to that I think can empower the stop as you move forward is to think of not it being your brain does that, but just a part of your brain.
Yeah.
So that you do not confuse the part for the whole. If you remember in learning about poetry, it was all about symbolism, where a part stood for the whole. And this is sort of like the reverse of that. We don't want the amygdala to stand for our brain.
Right.
It's just a small piece of nerve tissue. Now, not to denigrate small pieces of nerve tissue, we have a small piece of nerve tissue that regulates our heartbeat. Fabulous.
Right.
Small could be good, but small creating havoc, like a baby's crying on an airplane, that's different. We don't want a small part to in any way represent our brain because it doesn't. It's very different from the other parts of the brain. Again, if we go through, what's the purpose of the visual cortex? It's to see. How does your visual cortex do? You have an auditory cortex that allows you to hear. How does your auditory cortex work?
Great.
And you have, all these different parts that are doing wonderful things, even when you're having a wig out moment.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still doing all those things. And only one part is kind of in its excessive mode. Okay. So if, we were to invoke the comedian, well, excuse me, nature would say, it isn't a perfect brain. It's got a little trouble. It's got a few challenges. But if you step back from it, and look at it as a whole, it's a phenomenal organ.
Yeah.
And you are one of the people lucky enough to have one of those.
Yeah.
And what I encourage in this approach is really a brain appreciation course to help to understand all the amazing things that the brain does. And yeah, it's got a few kind of glitches with it and challenges with it, but nothing that we can't take on. Nothing insurmountable. Especially when we realize all the tools they were equipped with in order to manage it. And the corollary of that is also one of the things that interested me was to compare ourselves to other creatures that have brains that have no idea they even have a brain, and how much better off we are. Even with the challenges in our brain, having the one that we have, it's really a remarkable instrument.
Yeah, I kind of look at our brains, it's going to sound weird, but like our cell phones.
Yes.
There's so many things that your cell phone can do, but we just keep using and doing the same certain things with the certain apps we like. But yet it still has this capacity to do many wonderful things.
I think that's spot on, Wendy. And the notion would be that the prefrontal cortex is underutilized. And the other thing we know from neuroscience is that it remains open for development. That's not fixed. That part through these practice things can actually be strengthened over time. And that entire area, which is pretty vast, it's the biggest part of the brain, is open to and wants to be developed. We're sitting on oceanfront property and not even aware of it.
That's a great way to look at it too. I like that. I like that view.
But the corollary of what is up there in this upper register of our brain is our capacity for joy, contentment, for positive thinking. And the other notion here, in terms of what meditation training does, is allows you to be aware of where you are, locate where in the brain you are, just based upon making an assessment of what you're thinking, what you're feeling, And then if you're in the wrong place, if you're in the basement where it's cold and moldy, get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
And how do you get out of there? You take the stairs. If you have an elevator, take that. Use a rope pull, whatever you need to do to get out. Just, you're in the wrong place. And you're just in the wrong place in your brain. And that simplifies it. It's not a character assessment of you as a person. It is simply oops, I got myself into, parking lot traffic. And I'm trying to find a way around it.
Well, I know that you mentioned some great brain activities like word puzzles, crossword puzzles, actual, good old-fashioned jigsaw puzzle to get your brain working a little bit. Right. I always like to go back to nutrition a little bit. Do you have any good food that you like to recommend for people to purposely choose?
Sort of.
Okay.
I wouldn't get too concrete about that, but with a couple of ideas that I would put in. One is that the prefrontal cortex is involved with self-care. So anything that you're doing as a part of self-care, being selective about what you eat, how much you eat, whether it's truly beneficial to you or not, that is all prefrontal cortex activity. So the concept is that the capacity of the part of the brain that has a capacity to be selective, to align choices with overall goals of health and well-being. That the part of the brain allows us to steer our choices and our decision-making to be purposeful. I know why I'm doing something. To manage the part of the brain that is more automatic and driven more by cravings. That's in there too. And again, that's not the most, wise part of our brain. It can get us into a lot of difficulty. We got to figure out what to do with that part. A corollary of this is to think about one of the excesses that we have to deal with is appetite. And we can understand the elegance of the genius behind the fat storage mechanism in the body, which is put in the brain the impulse to eat excessively, no matter what, and convert all the excess to fat, because it was dealing with a survival guide for starvation. And then it would convert all the excess into fat so that in days when there was no food available, you would live off your fat stores. Now, how does that help us in 2024? We have 3 meals a day plus snacks. Mm-hmm. We're not starving. And we still have that hardwired, I'm starving feeling. So we realize that, unfortunately, there's another example of an excess that we have to learn how to modulate because it's always misguiding us. And again, the emphasis, it is misguiding us. It is, if you will, in the language used before, lying to us, deceiving us. It's just a small piece of nerve tissue. When we get to see how small it is, we say, you're the one that's pushing me to the ice cream and the cupcakes. I don't really need that. It's not good for my diabetes. Really. So getting back to the theme of food is careful selection, paying attention to ingredients and labels, and maybe some degree of don't overthink it, because overthinking comes from the counterproductive part of the brain. It's okay if you can find a way to indulge without harm. I used to run a weight loss program that was very successful, and I developed this concept called taste satisfaction. Now, a lot of people can't do this, but if you have enough discipline, you can eat a little bit of anything So one of the things that I have a passion for is jelly beans. But I can eat 3 jelly beans.
Yeah.
And it's not going to hurt me. So if you can do that kind of taste satisfaction, you can do the equation. But do I have to have none in order to not have too many? Or would I rather have a few that I can at least enjoy the taste of and then make a choice based on that? And again, I think for where you can find a way to indulge without harm is another form of problem solving in terms of food selection. But the greater part of the imagery that I would tie towards understanding about brain parts is all the brain parts want different things. The visual cortex wants things to see. The auditory cortex, it's hungry for things to hear. And the prefrontal cortex is hungry to be food for thought. It wants to be thinking about bigger concepts. What is the purpose of life? What is the meaning? How do these pieces go together? How do I make sense of all these different pieces? That's what it's hungry for. And other parts want different things. So the analogy that I use going back to my family therapy days is that if we think of the amygdala as like the baby of the family, and the question is asked, what do you all want for dinner? And the baby says, I want I want milk. The rest of the family is going to look around, I don't want that. So each part of the brain really wants and yearns for different things. All of it needs oxygen.
Right.
And one other concept that I would emphasize as at the heart of my teachings is that every cell, in order to thrive, has to be able to extract to its interior things that it needs to help it function. So we need to pluck oxygen out of the air. We also need to get rid of toxicity, right? So that's a kind of basic life concept. Take things in, get things out. Now, where mindfulness comes in for thinking about our mental states is that one of the chapters in the book is called mental dialysis, because it introduces the concept that we have a lot of toxic experiences we don't know what to do with. And there are lungs for the body, there's kidneys for the body, and there's all these overlapping filters that are helping to get rid of toxic materials. We got that. But what about for our mind states? We have these recurrent, very toxic, disturbing mental states, and we don't know what to do with them. And there's no lungs for the mind. There's no kidneys for the mind. There's no way that evolution was that far advanced to think we would need that. With the exception that they said, some of the stuff, you still have to take out your trash. You still have to manually do stuff. It's not done for you. And we are learning that we have to liberate ourselves from the toxic mental waste that is created just by the nature of living. And that we purposely train ourselves to identify, what do I need to let go of? What do I need to liberate myself from? What has become toxic to me mentally? One other corollary of this is that the part of the brain that stores traumatic memory is called the hippocampus. And lo and behold, that part of the brain sits right adjacent to the amygdala. And it's like having a noisy neighbor, always throwing parties, so you can't get sleep at night. It's a bit of a setup. And I did my training in Boston, and there was an area of Boston where you're not supposed to walk at night because it was dangerous. It was called the combat zone.
Oh, boy.
But in my book, I refer to this part of the brain, the hippocampus and the amygdala, as the combat zone.
But it's just one part. Remember, they're each just one little part.
It's just one small part.
Yes.
If you've seen this is the book, Me, Myself, and My Amygdala. And this is another book that I don't recommend that you read, but the concept is a good one, which is just thinking about the human amygdala itself. Just a part of the brain that's in the fight or flight business. And one of the things I would like to do is encourage people to observe nature, because we can learn from all sorts of creatures. So I was teaching a mindfulness group at a mental health center, and a group of people were there, and into the room came a fly. And the fly landed on person 1, person 2, hopped over to person 3, 4, 5. It just kept making the rounds. And pretty soon you started hearing, and louder, and then some choice swear words. And I interrupted the session to say, I think we have a mindfulness teaching moment. We have the opportunity to compare the fly's amygdala to the human amygdala. The amygdala, remember, is fight or flight. Not a lot of fight in a fly, but certainly a lot of flight. We were witnessing it.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're witnessing is how successful it was. 8 to 10 large, bulking human beings could not figure out how to deal with this fly. And its escape mechanism just kept working for it. So, and in comparison, we had the human amygdala, which in the end was not only aggressive, trying to kill the thing, but it was harming the self.
Mm-hmm.
In the pursuit of it, and then getting angry with the self for not being able to do it. And in that moment, I said, as much as I love the human brain, I think I like the fly's amygdala better than ours. It's just simply more useful. It's simply more functional. It simply does what it's designed to do.
So how did you activate the prefrontal cortex? What did you problem solve to get rid of the fly?
I don't even remember, but I think the part of it was that, it's only a fly.
Yeah.
And again, switch it from being a pest that needs to be dominated to an object of education about the subject matter you came here to learn.
Yeah.
It switched the perception. We didn't have to have a no-fly zone. We could imagine we welcomed the fly in so we could do a comparative amygdala study.
My husband used to have a saying years ago when we first started dating, and it definitely helped me a little bit. It brought me back to a small calm. It worked great for him, but I had to learn it a little bit. But yeah, he would say, when you get ramped up or something, you panic mode, that fight or flight. He's like, okay, 2 things. 1, you're not performing surgery on babies. And 2, you're not trying to cure cancer.
Right.
So it's like, okay. I mean, when you look at it in the sense of that, okay, let's take a pause for a moment and let's problem solve and use our prefrontal cortex.
Yes, I'm with you on that. I mean, there was a concept I developed years ago. I haven't thought of for a while, but just thought of now as we're speaking on this theme of what I call the power of the mosquito. Now, mosquitoes has a little more jalapeno pepper than a fly, because it can sting and can bite. But the power of the mosquito, the concept is that's all it can do. And it can make you, from a problem-solving point of view, go from the outside to the inside. But you can take steps on your own behalf to not be in the mosquito's path. And that, in a sense, by acknowledging the power of the mosquito, we're acknowledging the power to annoy. We grant it to anybody and anything, but not more than that. Not ruin our day, not ruin our afternoon, and nothing of that magnitude, because we're all overreactors to those kinds of things.
Well, it's definitely been a pleasure to have you on. And where can everyone find you, follow you, maybe book an appointment with you? Because I know you do your mindfulness trainings.
Yeah. The best way to reach me is through my email, ackermanpsychiatry@gmail.com. And, the book, Me, Myself, and My Amygdala is on Amazon. And I mentioned 2 other books that are coming out this year. One is called The Anatomy of Self-Harm, The Understanding and Treatment of Self-Directed Aggression, which is taking some of the themes we talked about today and even going a step further with them. And the other is that one of the things I've heard in all the groups and classes that I teach is, oh, geez, I wish I'd learned this stuff when I was younger.
Yep.
So I have the draft of a parenting guide for learning about the brain. It's called Me, Myself, and My Temper.
Oh, that will be good.
Yeah.
That will be good. Well, I'll definitely put some links to you as well in the show notes so people can find them, especially if they're driving or listening somewhere that they can't look you up right now. So hopefully they'll just click on the links in the show notes to find you.
Super.
And again, it's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us tonight.
It's been a pleasure being with you.
Thank you. You have a good night. If you are looking for a trustworthy place to choose all of your supplements, FullScript has 285 different brands to choose from. They did the work for you to check quality standards for all the supplements they carry. These standards are important because they help to ensure a product is safe, effective, and accurately labeled. FullScript uses third-party companies to provide unbiased assurance that certain quality criteria are met when they add a company or product to their inventory. When you set up an account with FullScript, use my link and you'll always get 15% off your supplements. If you want to continue learning and hearing all things nutrition for your mind, body, and soul, click like, subscribe, or favorite me on whatever podcast platform you use, or you can find me at ForgivenNutritionist.com. This podcast was designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to achieve your health and wellness goals. It is not meant to diagnose or treat any illness or medical condition or take the place of any treatments from your current healthcare providers.